Camilla, yesterday, just after we'd finished recording, Justin Trudeau, I'm sure one of your favourite political
Absolutely
leaders,
up there, yeah.
made a statement that he would be resigning as Prime Minister of Canada. He was elected in 2015. He burst onto the political stage. Rather good-looking chap.
Giant Nepo baby, but yeah, go on.
The son, of course, of Pierre Trudeau, who was Prime Minister of Canada on 4 occasions. So you say, as you say, Nepo baby to beat all Nepo babies. But he seemed to be the progressive future. If you think about Tony Blair, if you think about Bill Clinton, then Justin Trudeau seemed to be the next person to take the torch of progressive liberalism forward.
Take the torch to Canada, immigration policy in wreckage, economy having tanked.
He did have a number of very successful years, but his position was pro-immigration. His position was aggressive on climate change policies, pro-globalization, and he's been caught by the rising tide, the movement against those points of view, which we have seen, as you say, across Europe, in Germany, in France, possibly coming in the UK. That's the big debate. How successful can Nigel Farage and others be on the right? That progressive fix has been derailed, and more leaders are starting to struggle if you were the incumbent and you were a liberal progressive. I think there are just 4 things that ruined Justin Trudeau. And I put this on X yesterday. Keir Starmer will have noticed this. And although he's only 6 months into his premiership, he will know that this could be also toxic for him. And those 4 H's are high spending, big state, high inflation, high taxes, high immigration. And if you have that mix, the public will not continue to support you.
He also was undone by COVID.
Yes.
Wasn't he? I mean, he was so pro-lockdown. He was like Jacinta Ardern in New Zealand. I mean, it was ridiculous. I think we can agree that Canada's international standing has been reduced on his watch. And there's this... Again, he became a kind of contradiction and a parody of his progressive self, because on one hand, he's, preaching from the woke Bible, but on the other, it's discovered that he has blacked up 3 times, that he's appointed a load of the people that were groomsmen at his wedding to his own cabinet. I mean, he's investigated on numerous occasions for conflicts of interest. It's been found that he's broken the law. So again, it's kind of the truth of the lie that the guy who claims to be the kind of progressive future is actually perhaps somebody with his principles elsewhere.
What was interesting as well, Camilla, COVID was, yes, the restrictions, which were very controversial. They had very, very tough COVID restrictions on people's movement. But then post-COVID, and this is exactly the same problem that the UK faced, to fix supposed gaps in the jobs market after COVID, they allowed very, very high immigration. And for the first time, the public's reaction to that was very negative, just as it has been here, just as it has been in Germany. For the first time since 1998, Canadians felt net negative about levels of immigration because, of course, Canada has one thing in its favour when it comes to immigration. It is huge. There's plenty of space in Canada, but it led to all the same problems with young people in particular not being able to get on the housing ladder. Public services did not keep up with the huge increase in immigration in Canada. Many of those young people were original supporters of Trudeau. And growth only came from population expansion. So GDP per person stagnated and actually was often in recession. And that mix not only has lessons in Canada for Canadian politics and has seen the growth of the Conservative Party to this significant lead, but does have lessons in the UK, not just for Kemi Badenoch, but for Keir Starmer as well.
I mean, to be fair to Kemi Badenoch, she should look to Canada and feel quite hopeful, because the wipeout of the Canadian Conservatives back in 1993 made the last general election look like a walk in the park for the Tories. All but 2 Conservative MPs in Canada completely eviscerated. They then have to completely rebuild the movement. You then have the rise of Stephen Harper, who ran a party called Reform, like Nigel Farage is in Canada. He ends up being elected as a Canadian Conservative Prime Minister. But then we get this kind of rise of Trudeau and progressiveness in 2015, which is matched around the world by the likes of Macron and others. But now the main man in Canada that everyone's talking about is Stephen Harper's successor. Is he direct
No,
successor?
there was one between. So
Yeah.
Erin O'Toole. So what was interesting, when Harper lost the election in 2015, they went for Erin O'Toole. And what Erin O'Toole got wrong, which is where Kemi Badenoch needs to take care, which is exactly your point, Camilla, he stayed in the centre. He tried to rebuild, still being very pro net zero, carbon emission taxes, all those types of issues that have actually sunk Trudeau. He was very strong on carbon taxes, which added to inflation, which meant the cost of living went up for people. Erin O'Toole then failed in a number of state and local elections in Canada. He was then replaced by Pierre Poilievre. And Pierre Poliviere has gone almost precisely where that very interesting speech, which I'm not sure people focused on, we have discussed it in the podcast, that Kemi Badenoch made in Washington before Christmas, where he talked about, Pierre Poliviere has talked about fewer regulations, smaller state, lower public spending, more oil and gas. And Kemi Badenoch, who flew to Canada when she went to Washington, she then flew up to Canada and I think had lunch or breakfast with Poilievre.
I asked her about it on my GB News show. Let's hear that.
Pierre Polievre, I thought, was amazing. He's so impressive, and he is about 4 years ahead of me in terms of where he is in the electoral cycle. He is the leader of the Conservative Party in Canada, but he's in opposition, and he is part of what I see as a new generation of Conservatives who are coming forwards. We're not the past. We've taken our principles from, previous Conservatives, but we need to mold those principles for the age that we're in.
She met him, and actually, I think that is the playbook. I think that's where we were getting to in our earlier discussion. I think the playbook for Kemi is dial down maybe a little bit on the culture wars aspect of some of these debates. They're still important, but dial up just the very straightforward, the state's too big. The economy cannot work well for all of you if the state is too big. I want the state out of the way, out of your lives. I want you to flourish and be entrepreneurial. That is what I see as a Conservative offer, which could see Kemi Badenoch have some of the successes that Pierre Poliviere is having in Canada.
Yeah, because the interesting thing about Poliviere is, as you say, he has stayed away from some of the cultural war issues. So he hasn't really made a comment on things like gay marriage or cannabis or abortion.
Which is legal, I think, across Canada.
Yes, yeah. But he has spoken very cogently in what I would describe as sort of really consumer language about issues like quantitative easing, inflation, why it is that Canada is fast running out of money and spending too much on interest on borrowing. And he speaks in this kind of, without making it sound patronising, kind of working man and woman's language. So when he communicates with the public, he talks in terms of, well, if you considered that it was like apples and oranges, he kind of is able to translate fairly complex economic arguments into very simple positions that people can understand. And this is why he has connected, because this is what has been missing from conservative small c politics across the world for quite some time. This was the criticism made by the right that there wasn't anybody in the vein of Thatcher, Reagan and others making just really clear, simple, cogent economic arguments in favour of capitalism, perhaps in favour of compassionate capitalism, but certainly making the arguments against socialism. So we had all of this rhetoric, this sort of Corbynist economics that people thought, oh, well, that sounds actually quite good. I quite like to be given a load of money and not have to face the consequences for paying it back. To actually have somebody saying, well, no, that's not, for centuries we've tried this and it hasn't worked. It is probably better to follow a conservative small state approach, and this is why this guy is connecting, because it's like, oh, there's somebody who is unashamed in his opinion that it's probably a bad idea for the state to continue to spend oodles and oodles and oodles of printed money without actually having to pay the consequences.
I think there's one build on that as well, which I think is a very smart move, and I think people around Kemi Badenoch are very aware of this. He has been very challenging to big business. This has a slight whiff of the J.D. Vance in the USA, where big businesses are stitching up workers and they're not very good at what they do, and they just like to use regulation to protect themselves, and CEOs are paid too much. And that has slightly cut against the idea, oh, the Conservatives are just pro-big business. He's been actually aggressive, not just in his meetings with many business leaders in Canada, but also on social media platforms, about a little bit that tone of snouts in the trough, and you just want your part of the status quo, you're part of the establishment. And I think there is something there that voters like, because that feels like a politician on their side when everything is becoming more expensive, when you see CEOs being paid these millions and millions of pounds. I think that's another arrow that Kemi Badenoch can add to her quiver of what is it that's going to connect with the public about what they are finding irritating in their day-to-day lives.